Hello, and welcome to the Scriptures Are Real podcast. This is the podcast where we talk about things that have made the Scriptures become more real to us because we need all the power we can get from the Scriptures, and when they're real, we can draw more power from them. I'm your host, Kerry Muhlstein, and I'm so happy to have with me a longtime friend and mentor of mine, Terry Ball, who was, I think, the department chair when I first started to get hired here at BYU, but by the time we finished that process, he was the dean. We carpooled for years and served on councils together, and I've learned so much from Terry over so long. Most especially, maybe the thing I've learned the most is that if you know a good joke, it makes all meetings better. When he was dean, he used to tell us good jokes in those meetings. But anyway, just glad to have you with us. Terry's also an expert. He taught Isaiah course for forever, and he's written a great book on Isaiah that I love. And so welcome, Terry.
Thank you. Appreciate this opportunity.
Yeah, would you tell us a little bit about yourself? You're retired now. You're serving a stay-at-home mission. But what else should we know about you? I know you've got all sorts of fun stuff we can learn.
Well, I retired 2 years ago from BYU. I spent about 40 years as a religious educator. It was a great privilege, and I enjoyed it so much. And now my wife and I are serving a live-at-home member leadership support mission in Utah or mission, and that's been a great privilege for us as well. As a teacher, I love teaching Isaiah. I love this prophet. I love what he wrote, and I love the way he wrote it, and I love the way it speaks to me and the way it's blessed my life. So I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to share from these final chapters of Isaiah some of the things that have blessed my life, and hopefully what I share will be helpful to those who are listening.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, why don't we just jump in? You tell us what speaks to you in these chapters or just in Isaiah in general.
Well, the block that you asked me to think about was the last chapter, starting with chapter 58 and moving through chapter 66. And of course, Latter-day Saints love chapter 58. This is the chapter you look at whenever you have to give a talk in church about two topics: fasting and Sabbath day observance.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's a better discussion of either of them anywhere else in the scriptures. He begins talking about fasting. You know, when I taught Isaiah, one of the things I taught my students to look for that I think helped them to understand the prophet is that often when Isaiah was talking to his covenant people, he would kind of do what a doctor would do. He would be kind of like a spiritual physician for them. Sometimes when he spoke to them, he would be giving them a diagnosis, telling them, here's what's wrong with you. Yeah. Sometimes when he spoke to them, he'd be giving a prescription, telling them, here's what you need to do better. And then sometimes when he spoke to them, like a doctor, he'd be giving them a prognosis. Here's what you can expect in the future if you follow the prescription or not. And in chapter 58, as he speaks about the fasting, you see all three of those. In the first, verses 3 through 5, he kind of gives the diagnosis of a problem they're having with fasting. This chapter, the way this opens always amuses me, because in the third verse, it seems that the people are kind of telling Jehovah that he's not paying much attention to them and that he has a problem. As it reads, as they complain to Jehovah, they say, wherefore have we fasted, say they. And thou, that means Jehovah, thou seest not. Wherefore have we afflicted our soul, and now take us no knowledge. It's like, we've been fasting, and Jehovah, you owe us big time because we're fasting.
Yeah, we haven't been getting what we asked for. We paid by fasting. Where's our product, right?
If you ask a question like that, you better be prepared for the answer. And in the answer, the Lord gives a diagnosis of what's wrong with the way they're fasting. It's interesting. Let me read this. You tell me, Kerry, what you make of what he says is the problem with their fasting. He says, behold, in the day of your fast, ye find pleasure and exact all your labors. Behold, ye fast for strife and debate and to smite with the fist of wickedness. Ye shall not fast as ye fast to do this day, to make your voice to be heard on high. Is this such a fast that I've chosen a day for a man to afflict his soul? Is it to bow down his head as a bulrush and to spread sackcloth and ashes under him? Wilt thou call this a fast, an acceptable day to the Lord? course, that's rhetorical, and the answer is no.
Yeah.
But as you look at that, what's wrong with the way they're fasting?
Well, it seems like there are a lot of things that are wrong with it. Part of it is that their fasting is in they're going without food, but there's no heart behind it, right? They're still doing their normal things. They're having fun. They're doing they're going about life as normal rather than focusing on the fast and the drawing closer to the Lord. And there's a certain sorrow that maybe should be associated with this, but they're having their pleasure and so on. And then there's somehow it's tied up with strife and debate. I don't know. When I read that, I think of how I get hangry when I'm fasting, and maybe that's what they're talking about. But they're also doing it. That part, I think, where to make your voice be heard on high. So he says, you shall not fast as you do this day to make your voice be heard on high. You can take that one of two ways. You can take that as he's saying, if you want your voice to be really heard by me, don't fast the way you've been fasting. Mm-hmm. Or you can take that to mean you're fasting to make sure that people know that to make sure that people hear that you're praying and fasting, right? And you can take that either way, but I kind of suspect it's that former way. That if you really want me to hear you, then you got to quit doing these other things where you're fasting it, but at the same time, instead of taking care of the poor, you're oppressing the poor. I think that's part of the smite the fist with wickedness and strife and debate and so on. So anyway, I think if I were going to give it like the base root diagnosis, it's their heart's not in it. They're going through the motions, but their heart's not in the right place.
Yeah, it's certainly their heart isn't directed towards others. It seems to be mostly directed towards themselves. Like, look at me.
Yeah.
I am so pious. I'm fasting. Aren't you glad that when you walk into church on Fast Sunday, you don't see people in the foyer sitting on sackcloth, pouring ashes over their heads, saying, oh, I'm such a righteous person because I'm fasting this day.
I am glad for that, because I'd have to clean up the ashes. But
yeah.
We'd have to vacuum that.
Yeah. And you're right about that part. It says, behold, you fast for strife and debate. You know, the footnote says fasting without spiritual motivation only engenders discomfort and irritability.
Yeah.
You know anyone who gets cranky when they're fasting?
Yeah, me.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's me. I get cranky about an hour after I eat if I don't get more food anyway. So
well, I love what he does next as he gives a prescription in verses 6 and 7. He explains what constitutes a proper fast. What do you make of this? Is not this the fast that I have chosen? To loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to deal thy bread to the hungry, that thou bring the poor that are cast out to thy house, and when thou seest the naked, that thou cover him? Thou hide not thy flesh from thine own self. As you look at that prescription there, Kerry, what do you see are the elements of an appropriate fast?
So, now, see, this is supposed to be me asking you to tell us all sorts of stuff, but that's all right. I'll go ahead. But
I like to pick your brain. If you pick my brain, it's slim pickings.
Oh, no. But you can always tell when you're in the presence of a good teacher because they just keep asking you the questions. I think there are a couple of things here. As you said, the primary thing of the fast is not to turn inward, but to turn outward. And so most of this is actually focusing on taking care of other people and helping other people. And I think he's actually drawing a little bit on some of the imagery he used in Isaiah 62, which is drawing on the imagery of the Jubilee year and letting people go who have become oppressed or have become captive. And he uses similar language. So I think he's drawing on that a little bit. But I think part of what he's doing is saying you fast to, first of all, set yourself free, I think is part of this. So part of the principle, I think, is that, I mean, we do have to eat. Let's be clear. We actually are in bondage to the need for food. If we don't get food, then we're all in trouble. But we set ourselves free from that bondage just for a little while, not fully, because we still feel the effects, but we set ourselves free from that bondage. And hopefully that reminds us of how Christ sets us free from bondage to the natural man and all of these things that we are in bondage to. And so we can be free from the bands of wickedness and these heavy burdens, but we also want to let everyone else go free from whatever they're oppressed from. And sometimes that is just, you need food to eat. And that's why taking care of the hungry or giving them clothes and so on is part of fasting. You're helping them also get free from the oppression of just the natural world and the necessities of the natural world. But I think that there's some spiritual symbolism there as well, that we need to feed them spiritually and we need to clothe them spiritually and so on. So there are 1,000 forms of oppression. And when we fast, we should be aiming at freeing ourselves and others from all of them. And part of that has physical necessities, but part of that is by bringing us all to Christ, who's the one who really sets us free from oppression.
That's so well said. That's so well said. So as I look at that, I see him saying, of course, a proper fast includes abstaining from food for a period of time.
Yeah.
It includes dealing your bread to the hungry. We do that through paying a generous fast offering, right?
Mm-hmm.
Appropriate fast requires us to pay the generous fast offering. Sometimes I would have students say, well, Brother Ball, what if I'm fasting in the middle of the week for a roommate who has a problem? Should I pay a fast offering on that fast? My answer always was, well, no, unless you want the blessings. And then the answer is yes. But then this idea, too, that it's a way that we loose bands of wickedness, especially, I think, in ourselves. You mentioned that. You know, we say that fasting makes us more spiritual. President McKay taught that spirituality is a consciousness of victory over self. And the greatest battles in life aren't fought on the battlefield, but in the silent chambers of the soul.
Right.
The battle he's referring to, I think, can be understood to be that battle between who's going to dictate our thoughts, actions, and desires. Is it the natural carnal man, or is it the spiritual higher man inside of us?
Right.
I know that every time we make the desires of the flesh be subject to the will of the spirit, it's like lifting spiritual weights, and we strengthen the spiritual man and give ourselves more control over the natural man. So it makes sense then that fasting would make us more spiritual, because the spiritual man is saying to the natural man, I'm not going to feed you, or whatever it is you're fasting from if you can't fast from food.
Right.
So it gives you this victory so that you get to the point where you're more able to have the spiritual man, the higher, nobler part of yourself, dictate your thoughts, actions, and desires rather than the carnal, natural, sensual man.
Yeah.
I know that if there are things about ourselves that we don't like, things we'd really like to change, that fasting and prayer can help us make those changes. I know that if we sincerely go to our Father in heaven and say, Heavenly Father, I don't want to be this way. I want to be better. Will you help me? If we supplement that prayer with fasting, I think we gain access to a spiritual strength that really helps us overcome that natural side. And I suspect that that's part of what he's referring to in verse 6, that it helps us loose the bands of wickedness. And we ought to be fasting with that purpose.
Yeah, and undo the heavy burdens. I agree. And, as you say, it helps us, we say it helps us become more spiritual. I so much agree. Another way of saying what you've said is, in some ways, it helps us become more spiritual because it helps us become less carnal. And ourselves, we really are kind of a zero-sum self, really. The more we ignore the natural man in us and feed the divine side of us, right there. I mean, as the divine side gets stronger, the natural man gets weaker naturally, and vice versa. And so you just got to starve that natural man to some degree, maybe a little bit literally, but and that automatically ends up feeding the spiritual or divine nature within us.
Yeah. So a proper fast is not only abstaining from food, but is giving generously in our fast offerings, and then fasting with this purpose to improve ourselves and to access the powers of heaven for others. That's what he's saying.
Yeah.
He gives the prognosis here in verses 8 through 12. I love what he says about what fasting can do for us. I think sometimes we underestimate what fasting can do for us, but look at this imagery. Starting in verse 8, if you fast the way he described in verse 6 and 7, here's what happens. Then shall thy light break forth as the morning. I love that. Light here, I think means something more than electromagnetic radiation. I think he's talking about DNC 93 light, truth, knowledge, and intelligence. And think about how the light comes forth in the morning, how it comes up and it gets brighter and brighter and brighter throughout the day. It's like if you fast appropriately, you gain access to more truth and knowledge. Then shall thy health spring forth speedily? And there's certainly health benefits to appropriate fasting. I like the next part. Thy righteousness shall go before thee, and the glory of the Lord shall be thy reward. Or thy rear guard is another way to say that.
Yeah.
So the idea is that your righteousness will protect you from the front, and God's got your back.
Yeah.
He'll protect you from behind. Verse 9, then shalt thou call, and the Lord will answer.
Which is in contrast to what they were saying in verse 3, right? Where they said, we fasted and nothing happened. Now he's telling them, well, if you want something to happen, here's how to make it happen. So anyway, sorry, keep going.
Oh, yeah. Then shalt thou cry, and he'll say, here I am. If thou take away from thee the midst of thee the yoke and the putting forth the finger and speaking vanity, talking again about the inappropriate fast. He goes on and says, if you draw out your soul to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted, then shalt thou thy light rise in obscurity, and darkness will be as the noonday, even your darkest times. And the Lord shall guide thee continually, satisfy thy soul in drought, and make fat thy bones. Thou shalt be like a watered garden, and like a spring of water, whose waters fail not. That fount of living water we get access to. They that shall be of thee shall build the old waste places. You'll raise up the foundations of many generations. Interesting, appropriate fasting can bless future generations as well. And you'll be noted for the good you do. You're the repairer of the breach, the restorer of the past to dwell in. Boy, so many wonderful promises.
Yeah.
Fasting appropriately.
Yeah.
I don't know anywhere in the scriptures where fasting is better described. So I'm kind of glad that then those folks were whining about they weren't really fasting. They were just being hungry.
Yeah.
And there's a difference between fasting and last two verses, of course, address the Sabbath day. And I love the principle that's taught in verse 13 of this chapter. You've probably been in a position where you've had students who want you, when you're teaching a lesson on the Sabbath day, to put a list on the board of all the things you shouldn't do on the Sabbath day. How many hours of the Super Bowl can I watch before I have to surrender my temple recommend? It's almost like they want to return to the Mosaic law.
Yeah.
You know that anciently, Kerry, the Sabbath day was the commandment that marked a worshiper of Jehovah. It was the hallmark of a follower of Jehovah. We've kind of gotten away from that a bit, haven't we?
Yeah, I'm actually a little bit alarmed at how far away from that I find us moving. I'm surprised at where we've gone with this, at least many of the people I know.
It's like today, the hallmark of a Latter-day Saint is the word of wisdom. They'd make a great Mormon. They don't smoke or drink or nothing. And the word is a great commandment, but wouldn't it be wonderful if they said they'd make a great Latter-day Saint because they keep the Sabbath day holy?
Yeah.
But, in verse 13, I think there's a principle that's taught here about how to determine if an activity is okay for the Sabbath day. And it's not based on Mosaic law kinds of thing. It's the principle. Let me read it. It says, if thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, honorable, and shalt honor him, not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasures, nor speaking thine own words. You see the principle there?
Yeah.
So if you have a Sabbath
that next
day
line of verse
activity,
14, also delighting in the Lord, right? So it's not delighting in yourself, but in the Lord. Anyway, sorry, keep going.
Yeah. So if you're wondering if an activity is okay for the Sabbath day, you ask yourself, why am I doing it? Is this to serve God and others, or is it all about me?
Right.
If you use that principle to direct your Sabbath day activities, I think it opens up all kinds of avenues of great things to do. We have so much discretionary time on the Sabbath nowadays. Of course, going to church and fulfilling our church callings and worshiping, renewing our covenants, attending our meetings, that's always an important part of Sabbath day observance. But then you have this huge block of time. What if you ponder the question, what can I do now to further serve God or to bless and help others? And when you think about that, you get all kinds of ideas. So instead of watching the Super Bowl, you might go to the hospital and read books to children in the cancer ward, or there's just so many other things you could be doing that would be appropriate for the Sabbath day. And then, as you said, the promises in verse 14, then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord. I'll cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father. As an Old Testament scholar, what does it mean to you, Kerry, to think about riding on the high places of the earth and being fed with the heritage of Jacob?
I think it means you're going to fully receive the Abrahamic covenant, everything that's part of the Abrahamic covenant in full, which includes exaltation, but it's also, Isaiah is one of the ones that uses these images of he's borne us on eagle's wings, right? That he'll take us where we need to go in an easier way than we would get there on our own.
Yeah.
And where we can't get on our own.
And
how about you?
Well, the heritage of Jacob, I think, is the inheritance. It's ours as those who follow the covenant.
Yeah.
And you receive all the Father has as your inheritance.
Yep.
It's a promise that Sabbath day observant will lead you to exaltation.